from previous webinars, we know that about 61% of older people with dementia live in their own homes, and about a third of those people actually live on their own. We do know that more than ever, older people are homeowners, but we also know that many people over the age of 75 are at greater risk of living in homes that are not classed as decent, so they're non-decent. That means they may be cold, old, damp, they may be hard to repair or heat, or have not had repairs for a long time. So that's really quite an important thing just to bear in mind. So just like everyone living with dementia is unique, everybody's needs around their homes and housing situation is also unique. And for every person, this can be very different. This can be also very challenging to know when to make decisions or what decisions are there to be made. We also know that when looking at housing options, we know that that's not just done in isolation. We know that people need to consider the person's condition and how that's progressing, how and what support an individual may or may not have in their lives, what other factors such as health may have on that individual. We also know that for many people with dementia, there can be quite a long lifetime of living with dementia. So many people may live up to 20 years, some people may live very short times, and that's all those kind of things that have to be taken into consideration with the individual, their families and people around them. But what we do know is that one of the key things that help people make any decision is that they've got the right information, the right advice, and they know where to go when they need to make that decision. And having that information before you are in crisis situation. We also know that in the city there's a range of housing options, some that people will know about, some that people won't. But again, these options that are available depend on people's housing tenure, where they live, what kind of income they may have, the person's personal situation, and how they want to live their lives. So hopefully today we will be able to take you through some of those options. Next slide, please, Kate. And on the screen you will see the plan for today is to look at how we can help people live at home and remain at home. We can look at an overview of the extra care housing options across the city and how you might be referred and link into those options, and how we can support people into transition into residential care when living in a home if that is suitable and the place they're living is no longer suitable for them. Next slide, Kate. We have a great array of guest speakers today who have expertise and who work in all of these areas, who will be able to take us through that information and answer some of your questions as we go along. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to our first speaker, who is Joanne Slater from Newcastle City Council, who will then go on and make an introduction. Okay. So
good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us to give some information about housing and dementia. Kate, if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. My name's and this is part of Newcastle City Council Adult Services. We're the main point of entry really for all adult social care from the age of 18 right up to death. So it's a very wide ranging team and we get lots and lots of referrals. Kate, would you go on to the next slide, please? So I'm not going to go into too much about the team and the makeup of the team. I'm just going to get straight to the point really and talk about support to stay at home, and firstly when you might need support to stay at home. So we are a direct access team. Members of the public can phone in directly to our contact officers, and most of our referrals come from people, families, district nurses, other people in sort of primary health care needs, and it's really about when people are struggling with all the things that you or I have to do, and we call those activities of daily living. So, for example, I always think about it, the first things I have to do is getting out of bed in the morning, using the toilet, getting washed and dressed. All of those things are what people start to struggle with, and that is sometimes the point at which people are referred into our services. Other things are around meals, medication, and other physical problems like mobility and access issues inside the home and outside of the home. So I'm sure you've all seen where people have grab rails at the front door, extra banister rails, and we can even go on and, you know, talk about later in the presentation things like stair lifts and other larger pieces of work. But we also consider carers within our support. So there's some referrals, quite a lot of referrals that come through to us when carers are reaching crisis or carer stress. So them are some of the things why people would need support to stay at home. And then I'll go on to talk about what support we do provide to enable people to stay at home. So there's a whole list there in front of you. It's quite a condensed list, and I'll just give you a little bit of an explanation about each one. So commissioned care is care that we arrange with the private sector care providers, and we provide that to help people stay at home. You know, we can have morning calls. It's the traditional sort of care package that you'll see carers attending somebody's home to help them get washed and dressed in the morning, help them to take the medication. But also when we're not within the restrictions of COVID, we do provide daycare as well. So people who are socially isolated can go out and meet people in a social event, in a gathering, 1 or 2 days a week, or to benefit them in social encounters. We also have a meals at home service with the council, but what we'll also do is provide carers to support people to heat ready meals, so that the nutritional needs are also met. Reablement, some of you probably haven't heard of that service, but again, it's a Newcastle City Council service. It comes from the old care at home service, but now it's got more of a rehabilitative focus. So this service is funded by the NHS mainly, when it's a service which can be free for up to 6 weeks. The focus of this service, again, because it's called reablement, is on rehabilitation. They work with people who may have recently lost confidence following a fall, or have been discharged from hospital and need some support just to get back to their baseline level of functioning. So it's almost like a constant assessment over the 6-week period to try and get people back to the independence to enable them to stay at home. If within that 6 weeks the carers report back that the person is not going to be able to be independent, then we can go on to arrange a commissioned care package, which become permanent. Then we can review that regularly. The community response and rehabilitation team, we call CRRT, is a team we're actually co-located with at Westgate. It is part of a health team, but they work very closely with those and have good links with people to keep them at home in the community. They have physiotherapists, occupational therapists, podiatrists, and some care staff. So they really work together with us. It's a multidisciplinary team. We work together to support people to stay at home, especially after a fall, where it's really important to have occupational therapy input and physiotherapy input, in addition to the care staff to support people with the physical tasks of activities of daily living. So residential rehabilitation, again, very similar to the reablement, but this is where people have to have a period in a residential establishment for more intensive physiotherapy and occupational therapy support. It is not a permanent service, it's a temporary service, again for up to 6 weeks, to help people get back to the baseline and hopefully back to full independence to return home. In all of our hospitals in Newcastle, we have social work teams as well, who will help to arrange, with medical support, the discharge from hospitals, again, to make sure that people have commissioned care and reablement services to help them go home and manage things like personal care, meals, medication, things like that again. So that's another service we also provide. And just for fullness of my presentation, I think Kate mentioned that everybody's had a presentation from our occupational health service. That's part of our service as well. Again, goes hand in hand with the mobility and access issues that people might experience in their everyday lives. They tend to work with more physical boundaries, level access showers, stair lifts, larger pieces of work, things like that. Support for carers. Again, we complete carers assessments. We have a carers centre Newcastle that support carers, and carers are a big part of the consideration for all our services that go in. We're not only looking after the person with care needs, but we must support the carers as well in their caring role. So that's a big part of our assessment process. We have a welfare rights service. Again, we can refer people to welfare rights to make sure that they're on the correct benefits and maximise their income. And we also signpost people to voluntary sector services where they don't need a commission care package from us, but would benefit from other outside advice and input. Can you put the next slide on, please, Kate? So again, just for fullness of the presentation, hand in hand with our commissioned care, I think Justine Lockie had done a presentation to yourselves about Ostara and the telecare equipment. We can refer for that as well as part of any calls to our service where there's an inquiry, and we can make referrals to Ostara for telecare. They provide community care alarms, fall sensors, bed sensors for people who are wandering, etc. We also can refer for small aids and adaptations. For example, toilet raisers, handrails or grab rails as they are known, double banister rails on staircases, and other small minor aids and adaptations. Again, the occupational therapy team do assessments, and they can do adaptations for major works. They'll do the assessment, and if that's required, they will then, assess for provision of stair lifts, level access showers, wet rooms, downstairs toilets if there isn't that facility, etc. And other teams within our service, like I said, our service is the point of access. We do have other teams as well. We are quite a short-term intervention team. We aim to work with people for about 6 to 8 weeks to meet the presenting need, reduce risks, so that people can stay at home, mitigating those risks and reducing them as far as possible. But we do have other social work teams across adult services, and they are more specialist teams. For example, the Learning Disabilities and Autism team, again, another adults team, but very specific, work with people who have a diagnosed learning disability or autism. There is a recovery support team who works specifically with people in the community who have mental health diagnoses, who are YHN tenants, and they work with them for quite a long time to maintain their independence in the community. We do have a mental health team. Again, it's an adult team, so it's over 18s, and they work with people up to 65 years of age. And this is for more, again, for people with a diagnosed mental health condition who have quite acute issues with their mental health. So part of that service is also the approved mental health professionals, and they work alongside consultants and GPs. We have 2 other services which are outside our daytime hours, because our team is 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. So outside of those times, there is an emergency duty team that works from 5 o'clock till 8 o'clock the next morning. That's 7 days a week. Saturday and Sunday they work through the day. Have a focus again on maintaining people's safety in the community, but they are an emergency team, so we'll only really respond to emergencies, but can do so, and there's contact details at the end of my presentation. And we also have a team called the Emergency Access Team, and this team is a joint team between Health and Newcastle City Council, so there's a nurse, works from 5 o'clock till 8 o'clock each evening, and again for several hours on a Saturday and Sunday, and they have a remit of hospital avoidance. So if anybody feels that they need to go to hospital, we can ask this nurse and social worker to visit, and if there's anything that we can do to avoid their hospital admission, if it's not a medical issue, it's more of a social issue, then we can support them to stay at home. So that's another really good service which has been successful. Kate, would you like to put on the next slide, please? So how to access services. So as I said, my team, Community Health and Social Care Direct, is the main point of access for all adult social services within Newcastle. For everybody from 17 and a half, because we work with people in transition into adulthood, right up to death. And as I said again, our team is available between 8 AM in the morning, 5 o'clock Monday to Friday. So that's the main access to adult social care. The other adult social care teams that I've just spoken about there, the Learning Disability and Autism team, adult community teams, mental health teams. If you have an allocated social worker in those teams, you will already be involved with adult social care within Newcastle, and they will be able to guide you and access you to other parts of our service, for example, occupational therapy or welfare rights, should that be required. CRRT, the Community Resource and Response team, is generally by GP referral, and they work really closely with hospitals. Again, CRRT will receive referrals to their service from GPs, but sometimes GPs refer to that service for a social care need, so we will receive referrals from via that team as well. GPs will send referrals to us direct. Hospital discharge teams, if a person is self-discharged, they will let us know to follow that person up into the community. And also Newcastle carers, we've got a really good relationship with them, and they will let people in who are requiring an assessment or some further advice and signposting. Kate, would you like to put the next slide on, please? So what happens after you inquire about care and support services? So when we receive a call into Social Care Direct, we do have a discussion with the person who's referring in. Now that can be the person themselves, their carer, a family member or another professional, or even a neighbour. It can be absolutely anybody, and we will have a discussion about what the needs are and how we can potentially meet any needs. We always do like to meet the person really, but obviously under these restrictions currently it's been a bit of a challenge. But we do like to at least have a conversation over the phone with the person. And after that, throughout that discussion, we will talk about what the needs are. We will provide advice. For example, if somebody's not feeling too well or they might have an infection, we would advise seeing the GP. We'll talk about the different levels of support and different types of support we can provide, carer support or equipment, minor aids and adaptations. And again, that's all part of prevention, which is preventing the person becoming more at risk or, decreasing further in their independence living skills. So we can put services in straight away. Reablement is a really good example of that. We don't need to have done a prior assessment, Community Care Act assessment, before we can refer to reablement. But where an assessment is required, that would be the next step. We would gather information, complete an assessment, undertake care and support planning, and then arrange the package of care to support that person's needs in the community as best as possible. We're not always successful. Sometimes we can try things, but I know my colleague Stephen's going to talk about residential care options later on, and sometimes our assessment does have that outcome that when we're not able to mitigate risk successfully for a person to maintain their independence at home. So after that, then there's the financial assessment, which can cause some issues for people. Sometimes when we're arranging care for people, they ask how much it's going to cost before we can arrange it. So, sometimes we do the financial assessment initially, but we do like to do it in that process. So we have the discussion about what the needs are, we talk about what support we can offer, we do the assessment and care planning, and then we request the financial assessment. So Kate, would you like to go on to the next slide? Because I'm going to talk about finances more in that one. So some of the frequently asked questions that we come up regularly throughout our working week. And generally it is about, there is a lot of questions about how much will I have to pay? Do I have to pay for services? As a social worker or a social care officer within the local authority, it's very difficult to answer that question without that financial assessment being completed. There is a formula that's set out by the government. It's not set by the local councils in any area. And that financial assessment completed by the financial officers within Newcastle City Council will It does depend on income and it does depend on savings. When you have care provided into your own home, your property, or if you're an owner occupier of your property, is not taken into account for community care services in your own home. And if it's, if Mr. and Mrs. Smith live together and Mr. Smith is the person who requires the services, the financial assessment is undertaken with Mr. Smith, not the joint income of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. It's just on Mr. Smith. So then after the financial assessment, Mr. Smith, for example, would be informed of what his contribution would be to the cost of his care package. Now, the capital limits is there because it is different to residential care costs, which I know Stephen will go into later. In Newcastle, we have what's called a capital limit on community care services that are provided in the home. So the maximum cost that anybody in Newcastle will pay towards their care package at home is £400 a week. If your care package is less than £400 a week, you will pay less. So for example, if Mr. Smith's care package comes to a total of £200 a week and Mr. Smith is a millionaire, Mr. Smith will only have to pay £200 a week because that's the cost of his care. If Mr. Smith's care package then increases to £600 a week, Mr. Smith's still a millionaire, he has £1 million in the bank. Because of the capital limit set by Newcastle, he will only ever have to pay £400 a week contribution. That is very different to the residential care costs, which I'll let Stephen explain. So the other questions are, do I have to ask Newcastle City Council for support? Not necessarily. If you're happy to do so and arrange your own support, then you are more than welcome to do that. And people do sometimes have a mixture. They do ask us to provide some services and then they're more than happy to go and arrange their own service for parts of their care package. A good example of that would be that we would provide somebody, for example, with a morning call to help them get washed and dressed and manage the medication, but that person may arrange their own support with housework and shopping. GP and NHS services, obviously, excuse me, any services that are provided by the NHS would have to be referred to through to your GP. And mental health assessments, any diagnostics are all GP and NHS services. And again, remember the Community Resource and Rehabilitation Team, the CRRT, again, it's an NHS service, so therefore referred through via the GP. Can I arrange my own care and support? Absolutely. We wouldn't expect anybody just to come to us. We encourage people to arrange their own care and support. the services that we arrange don't meet everybody's needs. And, you know, but we're more than happy to advise people on voluntary sector, private arrangements, how to seek care packages from the private sector, and we will support people to do that and give them all the advice and information they require. And another service that Kate works in, InformationNOW, is a plethora of information around all those different services that are available. Kate, would you like to put the next slide up, please? So here's a list of contacts. I've put telephone numbers, email addresses and website information where they're available. I think I have omitted actually on there EDT and EAT, so I must send an update to Kate and Lynn and give you all the contact details for that. But as you can see there, we've got Community Health and Social Care Direct, again a Monday to Friday service. That is our main telephone number. It isn't a robot chat line. The phone will be answered by somebody, which I know every resident in Newcastle that phones our service is so pleased to get through to speak to a real person. It has been, you know, we've really fought to keep that service, and it is beneficial to us all. And again, all the other services are there. Care and Repair in Newcastle, they can deal with minor aids and adaptations. And I think I've got Your Equipment Newcastle. It's a really good website, and it takes people through a number of scenarios to see what equipment you may need. These are small aids and adaptations in your own home, and it gives you advice and information of where you can go out and buy those little pieces of equipment for yourself, you know, if you need them sort of very quickly. So that's me for now. I don't know if anybody's got any questions, Kate, or you want me to clarify any information?
Thanks very much, Joanne. It's Lynn here. So thank you very much indeed for that presentation. Very comprehensive overview of everything that's available. And we've got a couple of questions that have come through in the chat. So just to keep us on time, I'm just going to limit it to 2 for now, because we've also had really helpful answers from colleagues in the chat box. So the first question was about daycare services, and somebody asking whether they were still running at the moment, obviously because of the COVID situation. I'm actually going to give the answer to that, Joanne, because we've got some social care colleagues. So Claire Alders helpfully answered that to say the Bradbury Centre for people living with dementia, Dementia Matters Bradbury Centre is operating a limited daycare service at the moment. That is being operated with guidance from Public Health. At the moment, they can't increase the number of referrals, but that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be making referrals to Social Care Direct, because Claire mentions that this is the situation is being monitored daily, and if people still make referrals to Social Care Direct, they will look at alternative support in the short term until day centres can fully reopen. Obviously, this is a dynamic situation relating to COVID. And we've got another question from Barbara Douglas from the Elders Council. Is there an average time it takes to put a non-urgent commissioned care package in place?
No, Barbara, there's not, I'm afraid. I couldn't really tell you an average time. If it's non-urgent, we do like to complete an assessment first. And within Social Care Direct at the minute, we are looking at assessments completed within 4 weeks. But when people request a care package from us, we have a team called the care finding team. So whilst we're waiting for assessments to be completed, we do ask care finding teams if we can get a clear idea of what services are required. We can ask that team to start looking for that care package almost immediately, so that by the time we've completed the assessment, the care package is already there and set up.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Kate. Welcome everybody. I'm Fiona Dodsworth. I work in the Fairer Housing Unit. I also chair the Extra Care Housing Allocations panel, which I'll come on to later. It is a presentation in 2 halves. I'm going to talk about just provide an overview very quickly of Extra Care. Obviously the slides will be shared, so I won't go into massive amount of detail in terms of working through the details on the slides. I'll talk about the application process, and then I'll talk about the how eligibility criteria and how we assess people for extra care. Claire, I'll then hand over to Claire, who will talk about the on-site care provision. Could you go to the third slide, Kate? Yeah, next one. Next one, sorry. Brilliant, fabulous. So what is extra care housing? I think you'll just need to click on Kate to get the text. I was trying to be, yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Kate. So probably to summarise, and the best way to summarise, I think most people are very familiar with the concept of sheltered housing and kind of what that offers. And extra care is essentially provides a higher level of support and care. But what I would say is there is still a focus on people being independent, being able to live independently. So it is different to residential care. So we have, and it tends to be that most of the schemes in Newcastle have been developed very recently. So obviously they do take into account improved design features and modern standards. So they would look at kind of, really it's around improved accessible design. So most schemes, I think all the schemes will have Jack and Jill doors. So people, these are doors where people can open and close them either way, particularly useful for people who have a wheelchair. The bathrooms are fully accessible, so there is no need, unless people have got a very, very specialist need, to adapt those bathrooms. And there's adequate space for wheelchairs in each room in the apartments. And I didn't note on the slide, but there is also scooter storage in all schemes. Could you move on to the next slide, Kate? Brilliant. I just wanted very quickly to talk about dementia-friendly design features, because we do have these incorporated into all of the schemes, but there is particularly 3 schemes which I'll come on to that are aimed towards people who have memory issues and cognitive impairments. So I think in terms of from a housing perspective, one of the key principles of dementia-friendly design is to make up for reduced sensory, cognitive and motor ability to support independence. So it will pay attention to things like colour and contrast, making sure that where possible, that lighting is maximised so people understand, the passing of time. And in some of the schemes, the dementia schemes, the communal corridors are different colours, so people can help to kind of navigate people and know where they are. And just something I kind of noticed this morning actually is Dulux have some design guidance on kind of good colour palettes for people with dementia. So it was worth checking that out. That is on the internet. So if you are supporting anybody, providing advice to families, particularly if people want to stay at home, that actually might be a good little guide to check out. Could I go on to the next slide, Kate? That's great. I did forget to say, sorry, that my camera is typically playing up this morning when I've had to do this presentation, so I thought it would just be safer switching the camera off. So I'm sorry you having to hear a voice over a screen. So extra care housing schemes, we do have a range of schemes across the city, from a range of provided by a range of housing providers, such as YHM. So we do have 3 schemes, which are a CC House, Julie House and Hodgson House, which are specifically targeted towards people with dementia. So in those schemes, we will give preference to people who have cognitive issues and just emerging memory issues. So I've concentrated on the schemes which where we house applicants from the council's waiting list. There is a couple of other schemes in the city. One is a social housing scheme in Jesmond called Pilgrim's Court, and that's provided by Methodist Homes, and they actually take direct applications. We've got a market sales scheme which is provided by McCarthy and Stone, and I would just again direct you to InformationNOW because they provide further information on all of the schemes. Could you go to the next slide? Brilliant, cheers Kate. So in terms of applying for extra care, it is a two-stage process, but they can run alongside each other. So people have to submit a housing application, and that's done through Tanimere Homes. I've put the email address there. People go through and have to get a care assessment. Johan's just explained the services that Community Health and Social Care Direct offer, and then it then gets referred. Once it's gone through to that process, it does get referred then to the Extra Care Housing Allocations panel, which I will come on to. If you can go to the next slide, that would be great, Kate. Cheers, thank you. Okay, so once the case is referred through the Extra Care Housing Allocations panel, the panel, obviously I explained that it's chaired by myself, and then it is a multi-agency, multi-department panel, just so we make sure that we're looking at and fully considering an applicant's housing and care needs before making decision whether they're actually suitable for extra care. So we do have reps from Your Homes Newcastle, the adult services teams, and the housing providers. So in terms of the criteria for extra care, people have to be eligible and qualify for social housing. And I'll just touch on the qualify for social housing. That essentially means that we will take into account current and previous tenancy conduct, and also the levels of savings and assets people have. The applicant also needs to have a care need assessed by the council, and that a recommendation has been made by adult services that extra care would be appropriate. It is for people aged 55 and over, and as I've mentioned, there is preference criteria for the dementia schemes. So once panel has checked the eligibility criteria, they will have a look at then determine suitability. So we will essentially, that is around, again, what I was saying about fully looking at what their care needs are to check whether they can actually live independently, whether that's going to be sustainable, you know, in the longer term. Often we find that people are referred that actually just might be ready for residential care, and moving people twice would be a tremendous chore for people. We also take into account risk issues. You know, we do take into account that they are communal schemes, and often some people, you know, it may be that actually they will present a risk to other residents. And it's also taken, probably particularly with dementia, we do look at if people are wandering, because people can come and go in the schemes, and sometimes because of that, extra care might not be the most appropriate option. So I think that is a good time to hand over to Claire, just to talk about the care provision on site and to explain what we mean by independent living. Thanks, Claire.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Alder. I'm Service Manager for Adults and Older People Services. So I have the social work teams sit underneath me, as well as the occupational therapy team. And the reason that we wanted to look at extra care in the city was because quite often we were hearing that people were phoning up asking for residential care because mum might be up through the night and calling daughter 5, 6, 7 times a night, and we were having to look at carer stress alongside that, and it felt a little bit unfair for people needing to literally move from home straight into residential care, because all the time that we can keep people as independent as possible, that's what we want to do. So we were looking at, you know, what was that next step before kind of that last placement, really. And so with regards to extra care, we will always look at trying to keep someone at home with all the things that Joanne spoke about, so that, you know, because quite often people have lived in their homes for years and years and want to remain there. But if they can't, what we will then look at is the level of support that they need, looking at what they've currently got in place, and then looking at what the risks are and what other areas of support they need. So when we do assess someone, we look to try and keep the ratio in the properties as low, medium and high, because if we have everyone with high needs, it turns into a residential care home, and we can't have that. So we try and keep that balance, and that's also so that because of the staff that we've got on site within the schemes. So across the schemes, we always have a minimum of 2 staff, and I don't know if you know many of the properties, but they're all varying sizes. So some range from 16 apartments up to 46 apartments. So, you know, some are quite large. The whole idea is that this is still independent living. So we've got the carers on site 24 hours a day, but that doesn't mean that people can just press their buzzer and the care staff will just turn up as and when they're needed. It has to be planned support. So the social worker will carry out the assessment and consider, right, from the minute Mrs. Smith wakes up to the minute she goes to bed, what support is needed from that time. And from there, we'll then work out a set hours. So that might be that actually she needs 4.5 hours support throughout the day up until she goes to bed. And that's how we determine what level of care she needs. Whereas in the community, obviously, we have care packages set at, I don't know, 30 minutes or an hour. We don't do that within the extra care schemes necessarily, which makes it a lot easier, because we try and model it so that, you know, we can move people through those bandings to try and keep them within the extra care scheme for as long as possible, really. The maximum hours that we can go up to is 35 hours within any extra care scheme, because as soon as we go over 35 hours, that then tips into the needs are too high to be able to manage with the staffing levels that we have within those schemes. When someone does move into the extra care, anything they had in place beforehand stops. So any care provider that they might have had in place wouldn't follow them into the extra care scheme, because we have a contract in place so that we have the carers there. And sometimes that's quite difficult for people if they've had a care provider for some time. Also, as part of the kind of movement into extra care, they offer daytime opportunities, which means that if people have been going to daycare, that will stop, because we expect the provider to be providing those daytime activities. At the minute, it's really difficult because we're in the same scenario as the day centres. We can't have a whole group of people sat in the lounge, unfortunately, even when we do try and do social distancing. So that's on hold at the minute. But the whole idea is that really it's down to the tenants talking to the care provider around what they like to do, and then we can set up different groups. So there's loads of activities that have been happening across the city, which has been great. Just talking about carers now, quite often what we have is you might have a husband that has been caring for his wife and has been doing absolutely everything, and it's just getting really tired and can't, you know, doesn't feel that they need or can manage that anymore, but don't want their wife to go into residential care. They can actually move into the schemes with their husband, wife. that we can have that as part of the tenancy agreement, and which is really good, because it means they can then be the husband again whilst the carers come in and do the care. So it's really good for the carers, you know, and it's been really positive, I think, for the carers that I've kind of spoken to across the schemes. The biggest thing is we do want to prevent residential care for as long as possible. You know, residential care is needed when it's needed, but all the time that we can keep people there at home doing activities, keeping kind of, you know, in contact with other people. It's great when they're mixing and making friends. We have hairdressers on site in some of the schemes, we have restaurants in some of the schemes. It just feels like a real kind of community hub, which is lovely. So we are looking to have support across all of the city eventually. You know, we would like to build more and more. And it's working, from my point of view, really well. The social workers are feeding back that they feel it's working well. I do actually have 2 social care assessment officers cover all of the schemes. So if there's any issue or anything needs happening quite quickly, those SCAOs can work with the housing providers within those schemes and the care providers to kind of tweak support plans. So there's plenty more I could talk about, but I'm just conscious of time, but I'm happy to take questions later on if that's okay. Is that okay, Lynn?
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you very much indeed. So just I've got a list of questions that are coming through. So just a first question, this one's probably for Fiona. Fiona, when you were talking about the eligibility thresholds, question is, what is the income threshold that the asset threshold that would currently apply, and can people change tenure? So if somebody has owned their own home, can they then become eligible for social housing?
Yeah, this is probably, we have kind of a different approach, slightly different approach for extra care, just because obviously we're very conscious that people kind of needing this. So we wouldn't ever say, oh, you have to be in social housing to apply for extra care. This is from my memory, the assets limits is £100,000, and the savings limits are £50,000. But in terms of extra care, we do take into account that actually where people might be on the cost, that they couldn't go and buy a McCarthy and Stone scheme, but actually they've got care needs, which means that probably staying at home presents a lot of risk, and they're not quite ready for residential care, as Claire is saying. So we do consider that as a panel, and obviously YHN make the decision against our allocations policy on whether that applicant is going to qualify for social housing, but extra care panel can actually make a recommendation for that to be treated as an exceptional case.
That's great. Thank you very much, Fiona. So another question here. If you moved into an extra care scheme with a partner or spouse, and that partner or spouse died, can you still stay in the extra care scheme even if you don't have care needs yourself?
Yes, because people have a tenancy.
But what we look at is when people move in, when we're looking at the care needs, because we have the overnight support in, the way that we work out funding for the overnight support is down to every apartment within those schemes, so that the cost is split across all of those apartments. So should the service user pass away, the person left would be expected to pay that nighttime rate directly to the care provider, because they're still on site. So if something happened to them, they would be there to assist them. So that's why that's in place.
That's great. Thank you for that clarification. Another question here. Roughly, how long does the process take to apply for extra care?
Good question. I noticed this was from Barbara. It's variable, and it often depends on issues that people have raised on their application form. Things like, I'm saying, the qualification criteria needs to be checked. Some applicants are straightforward to kind of process, but obviously it depends on a case-by-case basis. Similar to a care assessment, it just depends on what people's needs are. We are, interestingly, because we're really conscious that sometimes it can take a while, and actually, people are at the point where they're really needing to move as soon as possible. So we are working at the moment on looking at how we integrate better the housing application process and the care application process for things like, you know, there is common documentation that we will require for the housing application side of things and from the care side of things. So we are looking at how we might use those so people only have to provide them once and they get shared. The panel, the extra care panel, once it gets through, once the applicant is referred onto panel, we actually meet weekly. So a decision can be made relatively quickly unless we've got any queries.
Okay, thank
Hopefully
you.
That answers the question.
Thanks, Fiona. Just one final question. Is there more demand for extra care than can be met from current provision? I think, Claire, you mentioned that if you had the magic wand, you'd be building a lot more schemes. So can you just answer, is there currently more demand than can be met?
Currently at the moment, no, we're fine. We've got vacancies across the city, which because people's needs change constantly, unfortunately, people are moving out because they're ending up going into hospital and extra care is no longer suitable for them. So because we have the weekly panel, we can monitor that. But currently, yeah, there are vacancies across the city, and we do have another scheme opening next April in Scotswood, which would be quite a large property as well. So we're constantly looking at where we're going to be building, but no, at the moment we're fine. And I just forgot to mention, just looking at kind of the process for applying for extra care, we also do have 2 beds in the city that adult social care manage within the extra care schemes, and that we call them rise beds. And basically that's an apartment where we can place people for up to 6 weeks so we can fully assess their needs. So say they're coming out of hospital and actually we don't want them to go into residential care because they can't return home for whatever reason, but we're not quite sure what their level of needs are. We will place them into one of the apartments that we rent and assess those needs for the 6 weeks so that we can really see if extra care is that next step, or where we need to consider care needs, and that's free of charge for those 6 weeks whilst we do assess those service users. So sometimes that helps with the process of applying for extra care as well, because people aren't always sure whether they really do want it or not.
Thanks, Claire. That's really helpful. And just a comment that's come in from Rebecca Fennick from Your Homes Newcastle, just in relation to an earlier question. So if a surviving partner, so if somebody dies in an extra care scheme and their partner decides they don't want to stay in the extra care scheme, Your Homes Newcastle can help them with an application for sheltered housing, which would give them a cheaper, less supported housing option, but it would still be for people over 55. So they don't have to stay within an extra care scheme. They could move into a sheltered scheme where it would be slightly lower cost because they're not paying for the additional support. That's right. So it's helpful to have that information as well. Thank you, Rebecca. So
thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Fox. I'm a team manager from Social Care Direct alongside Joanne Slater, and I'm going to try and talk to you a bit about residential care this afternoon. We've got about 15 minutes, so it'll be a very whistle-stop tour around it. Could go on for hours probably about it with all the ins and outs of it, but we'll try and do the best we can to give you a good oversight. So first of all, I'm going to try and start off with a little video. This is back from 2003. I hope this is going to work because technical things aren't my best point, but we'll see what happens. No, that doesn't appear to be working, so we'll just have to move on. But essentially, that was going to be a video of Peter Kay back in 2003 talking about residential care with his 55-year-old mum. So, and I suppose the reason I'm going to show it is because, a long time ago, really, the criteria for going into residential care was quite different to what it is now. So, although it was obviously tongue-in-cheek, you know, it might not have been that different for back then for people to go into residential care when their needs maybe wouldn't meet that criteria now. Probably because there wasn't the array of options that there is that we've already talked about today. So there is a little bit of a kind of misconception in some ways that you have to come through social services if you want to have funding for, if you need to go into residential care, sorry. So you only really actually need to come to the local authority for residential care if you need the local authority to contribute towards the cost of it. If you have over £23,250 in savings, you would generally be classed as a self-funder in a care home. So that would mean that you would pay the full cost of care to the care home directly. And in those terms, you don't actually have to come to the local authority. You can approach a care home directly, and you could move in whenever you wanted, really. So if you were Peter Kay's mum and Peter Kay decided to pass off to you some of his millions that he's earned, you could move into residential care at the age of 55 if you really wanted to do, and live there for many years, self-fund it yourself. You never even need to come to the local authority. But if you don't have that much money in savings, but maybe you actually own your own property, you could come to the local authority, and we would support you for a temporary period of time, enable you to actually sell your property so that you could then self-fund your placement in care. This is kind of what's called really a kind of 12-week property disregard. So it's set on central government guidance, and basically you have 12 weeks to sell your home. However realistic or unrealistic that is, that's what you're given. And the local authority would support you financially during that period of time. You'd have to make a contribution to it as well. But once that property is sold, you would then become a self-funder again and pay for the care home privately to the home. If you don't manage to sell your property within that 12 weeks, there is additional financial support that the local authority can provide, and a social worker could go through that with you at the time when you need to do it. In order to apply for a 12-week property disregard and support from the financial side of things from the local authority, you do have to come via social services for that. And if you have less than £23,250 in savings, and you don't own a property, you definitely do really need to come through the local authority to have a decision made about whether or not you're eligible for residential care. The kind of crux behind that is basically the cost of residential care. You wouldn't really be able to sustain it yourself unless you did. Currently the rates for residential care are around about £700 a week, so that's going to easily eat into your savings quite quickly. Similarly as well, I should also point out really that probably if you had just slightly over £23,250 in savings, it would probably also be advisable to contact the local authority to have some form of assessment or discussion about moving into residential care before actually doing so. Because let's say, for example, you moved into residential care and a month later approached us for funding for that. If your needs didn't actually meet the criteria for residential care, then the local authority would have no obligation to fund that. We would maybe look at other options like what possibly has been discussed earlier today, like extra care. So residential care is kind of giving us an oversight of different types of care, but there are various different types of care home. Given that we're talking about kind of dementia here today, and it's generally for more older people, I'm just going to cover the ones that do cover that category. There are other types, for example, kind of neuro rehab homes or specialist homes that provide support around mental health and learning disability and things like that. But we're just going to kind of focus on these four main types really, which is residential care, EMI residential care, nursing care, and EMI nursing care. Now, EMI basically stands for elderly mentally infirm. It's not a very nice term. It's one that's been knocking around for absolutely years. They have tried to rebrand this under kind of dementia residential care, but a bit similar to how social services try to rebrand themselves as adult services. Everyone still knows it as social services. Everyone still knows things as EMI residential care, EMI nursing care. And possibly one of the things about that is because dementia residential care isn't exactly true. You could still be in residential care and have dementia and manage perfectly fine within that setting. The kind of stage when you would move to EMI residential care is maybe more when there's a bit more kind of challenging behaviour involved. If there is a specific kind of need to sort of specialist care to kind of manage behaviours better, or prolonged periods of input that are required to manage anxieties and things, that's when it's maybe a little bit more advanced in residential care. So you would possibly be looking at the EMI residential care placement. And essentially, these are kind of tiers of level of support. Nursing care is where there is an oversight of a general registered nurse 24 hours a day. So they would have some form of nursing need for you to be in that kind of level. And again, you could have a low-level nursing need and still be in the residential care placement. District nurses still go into residential care homes to do little things like, dressing legs and bandages and things like that. At nursing care level, we're talking more about, regular kind of intensive input from a nurse that's required to manage those needs. And EMI nursing care is generally less about the nursing as it is more about the kind of behaviours that's needed to manage those needs in that level of care. It's kind of for the most challenging kind of behaviours, where there is generally a registered mental health nurse on site. And it might be, and I'm saying might be, that things like PRN medication might have to be given, things like lorazepam, maybe to have to calm people down, stuff like that, that needs to be given at a specific time dose. Those are kind of things that might tip people towards EMI nursing care. There are also other terms for things that you might come across, for example, respite and emergency beds. Respite is essentially a term that's just generally used for giving people a rest from the caring role. It's not something that the local authority directly provides respite. What we do is we would look at someone's needs to give them a break from their caring role. Emergency beds are basically something when, let's say, a crisis happens and you need to contact the local authority immediately because something needs to be done. An example for this might be that Peter K cares for his mother all the time. Peter K has to go off on tour at really, really short notice and doesn't know anything about it, but his mum's not safe to be left at home. Therefore, we have to then put someone into an emergency placement. So we'll move on to a little bit about when residential care might be appropriate for people. And as you possibly might have gathered from the discussions that already had been earlier today, residential care is basically when all other options discussed have been exhausted. So residential care is essentially a kind of last resort. It's mainly when kind of risks involved with remaining at home are so great that the safety becomes a serious concern for that person. So let's give an example that Peter K's mum develops dementia. From that video that you didn't get to see, you wouldn't necessarily know she had dementia or not. She could have carers going in 4 times a day, but as soon as those carers leave, she might start wandering out of the home. And when we're talking about wandering, some people sometimes misconceive that an elderly person with dementia leaving the house can be wandering. It might not be wandering. Wandering really is when they go out and they get lost and they can't get back home. And that's when really there becomes a significant risk to that person. So she's gone out, getting lost. We've tried to do things like put in assistive technology, community care alarms, or door sensors. Unfortunately, Peter's mum's just not understanding what those are doing. Peter's working away regularly, doing all his tours, so he's not able to respond to kind of come back and fetch his mum in. So essentially we're kind of looking at all the different options that we could try and do to protect that person. We could look at extra care again, but Peter's mum's so fit and healthy that even in extra care she's looking to get out and she's getting lost. So those are kind of like the sort of safety concerns that we're looking at. Another issue why residential care might be needed is people's overnight care needs. And again, with overnight care needs, we're not necessarily just talking about someone getting up regularly during the night. It's someone getting up regularly during the night and it being unpredictable what that might be or when it might be needed. And it also consists of the person actually needing support for those overnight needs. Examples might be incontinence, toileting needs, whereby the mobility isn't good enough to be able to manage that independently. You know, that they might be severely anxious and they can't be settled. So again, like Claire mentioned, there is overnight support available in extra care, but there is a limit to how much overnight support can be provided in extra care. So if you go beyond that level of kind of support, then that might be something that tips you more towards residential care. The last kind of thing really is if someone requires constant, unpredictable levels of care and support which can't be effectively planned for. Again, talking on from extra care, the level of support that can be provided in extra care is really great, and it's a robust package of care, but it is still planned in at specific times of the day. So you could have carers come to see you 5-6 times a day, but if, let's say, the carer leaves and 5 minutes later that person's getting up and they're falling over because they can't understand what the need for support around that is, it might be that that extra care can't meet those needs. So I'll talk a little bit about the process for residential care admissions and how the local authority goes about doing that. If you had a named social worker, you would contact the person straight away, but if not, you'd come through to Social Care Direct and we can certainly direct people wherever they need to be, or if they've got no social worker involved, it would be through us to help out with that. You would have a needs assessment to be completed by a social care member of staff, who again would look at all the possible options in terms of support. We do quite often get referrals in that say Peter Kearsman would like to be assessed for residential care. That technically isn't something we do. We assess people's needs, and an outcome of that assessment might be residential care once we've considered all the other options available to us. There are other things that we would look at as well when we're doing that assessment. So we might need to look at people's mental capacity. It might be that because they might not have the capacity to make those decisions themselves, we might need to look at what's in their best interests. And we might also need to complete risk assessments to see what level of support would be required or how best to mitigate really significant levels of need. Then once the social workers completed their assessment, they would then submit that to team manager like myself or Joanne. We would scrutinise it very, very keenly and very closely. And if we agreed with it, we would then put it through for a further panel submission where it goes to a service manager like Claire, for example, who would also then look at it and then make the final authorisation. So it is quite, a robust system that we go through to make sure that, people really are, of that level of need to have it. So when someone moves into residential care, probably important for people to know that all of Newcastle Council's placements in residential care are means tested. So that means that certain eligibility for benefits stop, for example, attendance allowance, and you're essentially left with personal allowance of about £24.90 per week, which again is set by central government. So everything else that people get, so everything like state pension, or they've got a private pension, bit of savings, that's taken into consideration, and they would contribute a bit toward. They would contribute that, apart from the £24.90, towards the care placement. There are some ins and outs of that. I'm not a finance officer myself. There are certain types of savings which are protected, but that is the general, just the rule. So it might be that someone has to contribute £150 towards the cost of the residential care, and the local authority pays you the £500. Once someone's moved into residential care, if they rented their own property or something before that, they would need to end that tenancy because ultimately they wouldn't be able to afford to pay for both placements themselves. residential care is different to extra care in the fact that in extra care you have your own flat, kitchen, living room, bedroom, bathroom. Residential care, you basically have your own room, which is a bedroom, and then most care homes nowadays have ensuite bathroom facilities. Some of the older ones maybe don't, and it's worthwhile pointing out at this time that there is a wide variety of types of care home in Newcastle. There are some care homes that provide all of the levels of care that are discussed earlier. Some just provide maybe one of those elements of care. Some of them are purpose-built buildings, state-of-the-art things. Some of them are old houses that have been converted into care homes. And to be quite honest, there is no one which way is better than the other. It can really depend on what meets that person's need and what's best going to fit the person. The main difference between residential care and extra care is the fact that there's care staff, including nurse for nursing care, available for support 24/7. So, there should always be support around for someone, as opposed to an extra care where there is support available in the building, but it's more planned support. And, it would probably be inappropriate if I didn't talk about coronavirus a slight bit, a bit of an issue at the moment. Obviously, it's very difficult for care homes in the fact that they've got to try and protect residents and protect the staff as much as they possibly can at the moment. We appreciate it's a really difficult time, but most care homes at the moment are unable to accept face-to-face visitors for people, which I know is really, really, really difficult for family and particularly once they've got to see their loved ones. The local authority is working closely with Public Health England and with all the care home providers in the city to work out what is the best strategy to try and protect people, protect their health. And we are working as well with the care homes so that they can try and do whatever they can to facilitate meaningful contact with family members during this difficult time. Last slide is I've just got a bit of information about where you could get advice about residential care. For example, the local authority's website, InformationNOW. It's got all the details of local authority care homes within the city. It's a really great place to go and get information advice, particularly if for example, you are one of those self-funders that wants to just find out your own information. There's also the Care Quality Commission's website. They monitor and assess and re-register all care homes across the country. So they've generally got in-depth reports on their website about care homes, although unfortunately they're not the most up-to-date. And basically Social Care Direct where I work as well. Really, if anyone's got any questions or advice, we're more than happy to take calls and try and support people. And that is literally my amazingly fast whistle-stop tour of residential care. If anyone's got any questions, I will try my best to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Stephen. That was, again, a really fascinating insight into what is really quite a complicated process. So we've got some questions coming through for you. So the first question is about residential care placements being used when somebody comes out of hospital. I've actually got an answer to that that's come in the chat box. So again, I'm going to give you the question and the answer that we've had from Claire Alder. So somebody had asked, is there respite care in residential homes on discharge from hospital? And Kate has given us, Claire has given us this answer. So respite is a planned activity throughout the year that they can look at with carers to assist people to have a break. If somebody can't return home from hospital, then the social services would look at a temporary bed, or what we call an interim residential care bed, which will be agreed for a set period of time to provide support whilst somebody needs that additional support, and then would look at how we can support that person to get back home once they're able to, and that's suitable. So that was a question and an answer there. So you got off that one, Stephen. Another question that's come in: if I am a self-funder, can I get independent advice from the local authority whilst I'm trying to make a decision about what would be the best option for me?
I guess it depends what I mean by independent advice. I mean, you can certainly come to the local authority for advice. We would never say, just because you're a self-funder, go away. We can always give you information, advice about what care homes are available, and if you were particularly uncertain about what level of need that you required, we can provide you with a needs assessment if it's necessary. The only thing that we can't really do is we can't say to people this home is better than this other home, because any care home within the city that's on our contracted list is assessed as being meeting the local authority's standards. So I couldn't say to you that the Manor House in Gosforth is far better than Sutherland Court in Fenham, because they are both essentially classed as meeting the council's needs. So really that side of things would be down to you to look at what you felt would be best for yourself.
Thank you, Stephen. So that feeds into another question that we've had in. So how do we know about the standard of care offered? And you mentioned the Care Quality Commission. So just again, if people were thinking about residential care placement for themselves or for a family member, and they wanted to know a bit more about those inspection reports and standards of care, just remind us, where would you go to get that information?
The standards reports would be from the Care Quality Commission's website. In terms of from the local authority's perspective, we, through the local authority, have safeguarding procedures. We have commissioning requirements with the care homes. So we also monitor the care homes, and if we feel as though they're not meeting their, requirements to meet people's needs appropriately, then they can be taken off our commissioning list, in which case their information wouldn't be on InformationNOW's website, and also we wouldn't commission placements with them at that time.
Okay.
So, lots of care homes, at some point in time do go through difficulties and through sometimes safeguarding procedures, and sometimes they can be suspended until they can make sure that they've got actions in place to better meet people's needs. So coming and asking us those types of questions, we're able to give you that information if there is a particular issue within a care home.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks very much for your presentation. So that's the end of the questions. So I'm going to hand over now to Kate.
So in terms of housing for older people, we have an article on InformationNOW, and it does include the extra care that has been discussed by Fiona and Claire. And it also includes those two private schemes that were mentioned. As Stephen mentioned, we do have an article on care homes in Newcastle, and we explain a little bit about the quality assurance process for those homes. And also you will see that you can link to any home, and that on each of those homes, the CQC widget, as it is technically called, is embedded. So if the CQC were to say that a care home was no longer meeting standards, it would say requires improvement, and that widget would be showing in red. And as Stephen says, you could then go through to that report and read more about that home. Over the last few months, because of coronavirus, a couple of homes have gone into suspension, and they've chosen to go into suspension because they're not ready to meet those needs at the moment. So there are internal quality assurance methods in most of the homes at the moment that are also being looked at by the council. But coronavirus does prevent the regular meeting and monitoring that has been going on. So a lot of it is done by the telephone. In terms of home care agencies in Newcastle, again, we have a list with a list of the organisations that are on the provider list. So that is monitored constantly as well. And again, the QA and CQC information can be found there. We have an article on care and support, and that explains about the needs assessment. And it also links you to the carers assessment should that be required. We have an article on your care and financial assessments, and then paying for care, and that includes cost calculators. So you may find that useful at the time. So now I just want to do a little roundup, as I usually do, about what we've been doing as the prevention team as part of adult social care. And as ever, I just want to thank everybody for their help and support, because if you didn't send us the information and provide the information, then we wouldn't be as up to date as we are generally with the information in the city. So some of you were on the August webinar with us, and I showed these two pyramids. So what you can see here is that the health information that people have been seeking has been pretty static. So anything in blue was on the same list last time. What's changed is that people are looking for information on support groups. And what they'll be doing is going to that article and then finding the support groups that exist and then finding the online support. In some cases, there were meetings across the city, of course, from June through to September before we went into our new tiers of lockdown. On the social care pyramid, you can see the changes in people's behaviour relating to what we were allowed to do after that initial lockdown. So you can see that people were looking for accessible public toilets because they wanted to get out, but they were worried about where they would get access to toilets. You can also see that people were looking at where to travel and what the corridors were, etc. And that's why they were looking at our foreign and Commonwealth travel pages. And interestingly, you'll see that, again, people were looking at housing for older people. And they were very keen on it. And they'd obviously found out, probably through InformationNOW news and other channels, about Hodgson House. And they were particularly looking at what was available in terms of support and care in extra care housing. So just to carry on from that, this is the new prevention and support information we've been involved in the last few months. And of course, as you know, we're pretty website led in the council, but we do know that so many people do not have internet access, and that was highlighted through the coronavirus first stages. So we've contributed twice to the Lockdown Gazette by the New Bridge Project and to distributing it as well. So we've taken it out to food banks and to some of the community and family hubs. We've also been involved in distributing the CNTW Foundation Trust leaflet, which was a wellbeing and mental health guide. And many of you may have received it through your doors, but we also tried to make sure it went to other community hubs as well. More recently, we contributed and helped in the distribution of the Age Proud creative brochure. And I do think that was quite a departure for everyone in the team. And it's been a nice mix of both creativity and information, and maybe a format that we look at for the future. We've done 12 radio Tyneside and later life audio radio podcasts with a number of providers of information in the city, and particularly with the voluntary sector. We've done 12 InformationNOW news, and we've done a redesign and soft launch of Your Equipment Newcastle, which I think I showed to many of you in the last workshop we did on equipment and aids. And I am going to do a user-friendly guide for you